Puget Sound, and I'm really excited to welcome you in this special event with Colin Hahn. We're going to be talking about data fundamentals for a talent development workshop. Just a couple more slides, as you probably have seen them before, a reminder about ATD. So ATD, our chapter, is pre-approved for Certification Institute for providing continuing education credits. Just want to make sure you remember. There is a ATD Power membership that gives you a lot of great stuff. If you ever check out anything at ATD national events, conferences, workshops, don't forget to put a code 8020. It's just a way to give back to the chapter, give us a credit, and cost nothing to you. If you're ever interested in volunteering, planning an event, or doing some research, or a survey, or just anything to improve the chapter, or just a way to give back, feel free to email to volunteerrecruiter@atdpugetsound.org. And if you want to learn more about the board, there is a link below there too. As all of you probably have seen this before, ATD has a capability model, and each class or course or workshop we offer covers one or if not more areas of this capability model. So today, the special event covers all three parts of this model. For developing professional capability, it covers training, delivery, and facilitation, and knowledge management. For personal capability, it covers lifelong learning, and organizational capability, it covers data and analytics. That's probably why you're here. So here, I just want to present our speaker for the day, Colin Hahn. He works as a learning and organizational development manager at Douglas Dynamics, and he spreads the organizational people analytics strategy, and he's responsible for learning and development function and supports talent assessment and succession planning functions. He has been in the space for over 15 years and served as a president of his local ATD chapter, and now he serves as a national advisor for chapters with ATD. With that, welcome, Colin. I'll give the speaker to you.
All right, great to see everyone. I am very excited about the conversation today. We've got the session recorded. Hopefully you're going to be able to access that afterwards. If there's some pieces that come up here, I will also make sure that you can get access to the slides here, so you don't need to be frantically trying to do, screen captures or something like that. Occasionally, I will present at conferences or, submit to present, and they will ask, hey, can you submit a recording of you speaking at something? If you would prefer me not to use this recording for that, or, let me know. Otherwise, hopefully there's gonna be some clips here of some great conversations that I can use. And we're gonna just jump right into it. I'm gonna start by just saying thanks for having me here. I love to work in this space. I really get to play at the intersection of improving organizational performance through talent strategy and people data. And today we get to talk about some ways to make that easier and hopefully more meaningful for you. I've got a couple of assumptions about where you are in this journey and why you're here. And so I want to just do a quick validation of this. If you can either give me a thumbs up on screen or wave or do like a virtual reaction if this matches you. My first assumption is that you work in a people function. Based on the titles I was seeing so far, I think it's going to be a good fit. The second assumption I'm going to make is that you want to use data to get better. This is not just, kind of fun. It's not just a hobby thing. Like, this is something that you really see that there's potential here, and you want to learn how to leverage those possibilities. A third assumption I'm making is that you are new or newer to business intelligence. So if you are regularly working with machine learning models, you are probably in the wrong place. If you have heard of this Power BI thing, but that sounds kind of scary to you, this is definitely a safe zone for you. And then the final assumption I'm making is that you're looking for some easy starting points. This is a space that can get really complicated. And there are some organizations that are doing some incredibly sophisticated stuff here. I don't necessarily want to get into that level of it unless that's truly where you want to take the conversation. I think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in this space, and my goal is that you walk out of here feeling like this is something that you can manage. This is something that you've got some things you can implement right away. Is that an all right framing for us to use for our conversation today? Seeing no one jumping off of the Zoom immediately, we're off to the races. I'd like you to pull up the chat window for just a second. And we're going to talk about some of the examples that come to mind here. This is going to be a workshop. And so I want to, throughout this conversation, work with some of the situations and examples that come up to you, and really walk through this data workflow cycle that we're going to introduce with the types of situations that you are in. As we do that, if I were to say like learning objectives for the session, I want to help you translate some business goals into metrics and give you some tools so you can start to think about how you would reduce your uncertainty around some of these decision points. I want to give you some ideas of existing data sources that you can leverage so you're not walking out of here thinking, oh, I need to create a brand new tracking tool or deploy a new survey or something like that. And then finally, I want you to walk out of here with some data storytelling techniques that are some relatively simple ways to be able to level up your communications and your sharing of the insights you've gotten from this data with some of your team members, stakeholders, project sponsors, executives, those sorts of things. With that as our goal, let's start by just getting a couple of ideas in the chat. What are some things around the talent space that you would like to measure? I'm deliberately leaving that vague, and we'll find out more why in just a second. So I apologize for leaving you with a cliffhanger, but how would you put that down there? Marlene has got a perfect example of an answer to start us off here. So leader development, how would we measure that we have a developed leader? I'll wait for a handful of answers to pile in here as you get some ideas of kind of what we should be talking about. ROI of programs, learning retention, program effectiveness, onboarding completion, training effectiveness, impact of training and business objectives, our upskilling programs closing the skills gap. I was just at a conversation this morning around that. How do we measure whether or not the skill has developed? Yeah, what you are coming up with are classic examples I think a lot of us in the profession are thinking about right now. And so again, safe space, like this is exactly the type of stuff that we wanted to be talking about. I think this is going to be a really fruitful conversation for us. We're going to work through some examples of these as we go through the exercises in our session. I'm going to encourage you to jump in with questions either in the chat or maybe use Zoom's raise hand feature or whatever if you want to jump in some places here. And we'll really try to think about how we approach some of these from a strategic perspective. As we do that, I think it's helpful to remember that this is a really critical part of our ability to be those strategic partners to the business. When the HD capability model describes data and analytics, they talk about how these are our connection to the key drivers for organizational performance. And if we're trying to affect, retention, engagement, learning, and really drive some of these business goals, the language to do that is around data and analytics. The challenge here is that this is the weakest area of our profession. When people took the capability model self-assessment, data and analytics didn't show up at the top of the list or the middle or towards the bottom. It was dead last. And I think it's worth just pausing for a second and saying, what might be some reasons why talent data is so difficult? I'm going to pick on Sarah for just a second here because I, have had a chance to get to know her through my work on the National Advisor for Chapters group. And for those of you who know Sarah, I am willing to bet that you share this understanding I have of her, which is that she got into the talent development space because of her deep love of spreadsheets and statistics, right? I mean, that's who she is, and I'm sure that the rest of you are like that as well. If you can't tell by Sarah's face, that's not at all why she got into this space. The reality is that for us as HR professionals, most of us got into this space not because we wanted to be Excel gurus. It's because we enjoy seeing people being able to do great work and seeing how energized they can be in the right sort of work environment. And so, whether our passion is from enabling others or thinking about how to help organizations create great inclusive cultures, right? Our focus has always been on the human side much more than the stats side, and our professional training reflects that. You can get a master's degree in human resources without having taken classes on data mining, for instance. The other piece of this is that the folks in operations have a lot more precision to the data that they are playing with. Talent data is just inherently softer than operational data. I work in manufacturing. I can go down to our shop floor and find out what our warranty dollars are as a percent of total sales. They track that number very carefully. They know exactly how many minutes that press brake machine has been down over the last 2 weeks. Like they're good with those sorts of things. When we are assessing if someone is a high potential employee or how effective someone's communication skills are, we're not going to be evaluating that to 3 decimal places. It's just not the way that that data is constructed. And so if we don't know how to think about softer data as being stuff that we can do math with and communicate statistical information, we're going to have a hard time because the work that we're doing just isn't amenable to the same type of spreadsheet computation as you get in other disciplines. All right, so what we need to do then is think about some easy and approachable methods for taking talent analytics. Is this sounding comfortable so far? All right. Then I want to take a little side tour into the pinnacle of my illustrious poker career, which was the Bulldog Tavern at Gonzaga University one summer night back in 2003. I was playing heads up against one of the co-members of the Gonzaga Debate Institute staff. And as the evening was going on, I had had a few beers at the Bulldog and was probably not having some of the best judgment about when I should or should not be playing specific hands. But somehow, in that game of Texas Hold'em, the final card hit, and I realized that I had the best straight that was possible on the board. Right? So I'm looking at my cards and thinking to myself, what do I do now as my opponent bets into me on the river? Now, at that moment, there was a lot of stuff that was running through my mind, right? First of all, do I in fact have a straight? Is that 5 cards or just 4? I make sure I did my math right? Is there a flush on the board? I've got to be very careful about these things. But after convincing my drunken self that I in fact did have the best possible hand at that moment, then I needed to decide how I was going to play with my opponent betting into me. At that moment, would it have been worth anything to me if my opponent had flashed me what one of his cards was? The answer is no. And the reason is because nothing he could have showed me would have changed what the right play was for me in that moment, right? He's already bet into me, right? I can fold a winning hand, which means I'm going to walk away from all that money. I can call, which means that I'm just going to get what's in the pot, right? Or I can put more money in, which means worst case, I'm getting everything that's in the pot. Best case, I'm getting more money out of him, right? More information about what was in his hand was going to do absolutely nothing for me at that moment. And this is a critical point for us to understand. When we are looking at different metrics and stats, the information that we are gathering only adds value when it improves the expected outcome of a decision, right? My decision about what to do in that moment of a poker hand, right, was not going to be improved by knowing if he had 2 pair or a bluff, right? The only information that was relevant was the stuff that I already had. And so more information was not going to improve my decision making. When we think about the types of metrics that we generate as talent professionals, we always need to be asking the question, what decision is this going to influence? And number two, how would this information change my decision depending on what I learn? If it's not going to do either of those things, if it's not going to change a decision, or you're not able to tie it to a decision, then it's just noise. And one of the most important things for us to realize is that the fact that we can put a number to it or we can generate a report doesn't mean it has value. The value comes from being able to improve our decisions. Does that idea make sense to folks? So Marlena, you've got a great observation in the chat here, right? So when we're thinking about information that impacts our budgets, yes, if we are identifying that this program needs additional resources to be able to meet our audience need, right? Right now we've got an onboarding program that's in place, and one of the things that's a struggle is we don't have enough people who are qualified safety trainers across all of our sites to be able to deliver the training in the timeline that we have specified, right? That is a very legitimate data point to bring in to say that with our current staffing, right, we are having X% of our employees who are behind on their safety training, which represents this kind of organizational risk for us. Because of that, we should be allocating more resources to additional safety trainers, right? That is a great example of where that information would impact our budgets, right? But if I were to report out on what the net promoter score is of our open enrollment classes, and my metric there is that we have a 73 net promoter score against a target of a 68. Does that mean we should be offering more classes? Does that mean that we should be promoting them to a bigger audience? Does that mean that our facilitators should be getting bonuses for how awesome they are? Like what am I doing with that? And if I don't know what decision that's going to be, then I've got to ask some really hard questions about whether that data point was worth something. Yeah, Marlena, question.
Doesn't it validate like what we're doing though, and it shows people that we're on track if we have a high net promoter score?
Well, it could, right? That could very well be a decision that you're making. That part of what we're looking for is, is this program meeting the participants' expectations, right? The way that we are thinking about Net Promoter Score internally, this is not the only way to do it, right? But we have that as a question on our open enrollment classes. We've got a nominal target that we are thinking about internally for kind of where we expect things to be. But honestly, it's more of a smoke detector for us. If we have a class that is way out of line from where the other classes are, that's a good sign for us to ask some questions about why that class is underperforming. But if we have a class that is a 62 against our target of a 64, that's not necessarily a problem for us, right? And so in that case, digging into more about why is that class underperforming, that information is probably not going to drive any decisions about us revising that class or offering it more or less frequently. And so it's not worthwhile for us to do that extra analysis. Okay. So if we're trying to use information and data in order to drive better decision making, then there's a cycle that we walk through, which I've labeled the data workflow cycle. And there's 5 steps here. Congratulations, we've just finished step 1 here, which is that we start off by asking questions. What are we going to do with this? What decision is this going to influence? And that's questioning happens before we go in and start doing analysis of data points or trying to gather up different metrics. This is the starting point because it informs what we're doing through the rest of this cycle. Once we've identified what decisions are at stake, then we can start getting to the process of defining metrics, right? What should we be measuring? What are we paying attention to? And that then in turn allows us to gather data. What we will find oftentimes is that there is some interplay here. And so we might have the ideal version of data points, but we realize we're not going to be able to get that, or it's going to take us a couple of months to get baseline data or something like that. And so we've got some ways then to maybe think about, okay, well, is there a different metric that we could use that's going to be useful? From there, we can start doing some analysis and then figure out how to communicate those insights to folks. This cycle is very much an iterative process. As you get more comfortable with this, you're going to recognize there's places where we can play around with this, that you might substitute metrics because you're able to get the data a little bit easier for metric A versus metric B, and it's going to be useful enough for whatever decisions you've identified in the asking questions phase, right? You may be analyzing something and realize, oh, it'd be really helpful to have some additional metrics around that. Let's go and build these out for the next iteration. And frequently, as you go through this process, you'll come up with new questions and just start the whole loop over and over again. So don't feel like this is a one and done. These are the types of things that you work through in this process. And what we're going to do today is organize our conversation around these 5 areas. Again, part 1, asking the questions. We've managed to check that one off. Defining the metrics is where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. That's going to be probably about the next hour of our time together, because there's a fair amount that goes on there. At that point, we'll do a break, give a chance to stretch your legs, kind of move around a little, and then we'll jump into the back half of this. Gathering data and analyzing, we're not going to spend a ridiculous amount of time on each of those. I've got a couple of examples that we'll talk through, but I really want you to be able to have some ideas in your head, because it's going to be hard to do it on the fly with your own examples if we haven't already done some of the metrics work beforehand. The communication part, we will spend a little bit more time on as we get towards the end, because that's a great place where if your head's now starting to swim, we can take a step back and say, all right, here's some stuff that's going to be really actionable out of this, and some things that you can do with the data that you're already playing with right now. Okay. Any questions about that overall agenda that we're about to embark on? Awesome. Well, let's start talking about different metrics here. And I see a question in the chat here about the poker hand. Good news is that I ended up winning that hand, which you knew already, because finding out what my opponent's cards were going to be was not going to change any information there. The good news is that I was not intoxicated enough to realize that putting some additional chips in the pot was a good move there. And so let's just say that it ended up being a very good night. We will not talk about the next morning. Defining metrics. Anyone in the group fan of Wordle? All right, Nicole, I saw a big thumbs up from you. Can I put you on the spot for just a second? You're going to try to guess what the word of the day is. And I'm going to give you 2 options here. You can start off your guess with either the word query or the word stare. What do you think is going to be a better way to start this puzzle?
I would go with stare.
Okay, why?
Because Q and U are not letters that commonly appear in Wordle, but S and T and A and R and E are.
Yeah, right. And hopefully the idea that stare is going to be helpful in narrowing down these possibilities is something that makes sense, kind of intuitively. If you haven't played Wordle before, then you should. It's a fun game. But the basic idea here is that we want to try to narrow down our uncertainty. In the game of Wordle, right, when I'm starting out, there are 12,972 possibilities for those 5 letters that I can plug in as a valid word, if you're counting or something like that. And my goal is to get that down to what's the one matching word in as few guesses as possible. Now, if my first guess is query and the word of the day is queen, I'm off to the races. Life is good. But that's not going to happen very often. Most of the time, I'm going to learn that there's an E somewhere in the word, and there's a lot of things that match that. And so if you average this out, my expectation is that from those 12,972 possibilities, query is going to reduce it down to an expected 811 matches, right? It's reduced down the possibilities like pretty well. I'm still going to be able to make a reasonably good second guess and have a chance to figure out the word, eventually. But it's not going to do as good a job as stare. Because if my first guess is stare, then I'm expecting that there's going to be about 227 matches, right? If a word doesn't have an S in it, then that's narrowed down a lot of possibilities very quickly, right? If there's an A, but it's not in the third position, right? That's very useful information to me. And so this process of being able to narrow down our range of uncertainty really is something that I think we do intuitively. What I'm going to suggest is that although you don't think of it this way, guessing query or guessing stare are both ways to take measurements of what our target word is. They are both ways to reduce uncertainty, right? And although we don't normally think of that way, it's going to be helpful for us to think about talent data in the sense of reducing uncertainty. Any information that reduces our uncertainty can be a form of measurement, right? I can measure the temperature outside by pulling up my weather app on the phone, right? Or I can look outside and see if it's sunny today. And in Wisconsin, at this time of year, if it's sunny, I'm expecting that the temperature is going to be somewhere between 60 and 75, but it's not going to be 95, right? And it's probably not going to be 35 either, right? Now, is that enough narrowing down my uncertainty to figure out what I should be wearing when I'm, heading outside? If I'm just jumping in my car quickly and I'm going to be going into a climate controlled building at the end of my trip, it's probably good enough, right? If I'm going to be spending the day outside, I might want to take a look at the weather app. But what I want to do is emphasize this idea that we don't need to have perfect metrics, especially for soft things like talent data. What we need is metrics that can reduce uncertainty enough that we can make better decisions. This is a big moment here. So I'm going to give a second for you to process that, for you to think about it, to see what questions are coming through your head. Because if we can realize that measurement is not having an exact Excel calculation, it's any observation that reduces uncertainty, that's going to make the rest of our lives so much easier in this space. Give me some, I'm seeing a couple of heads that are sort of nodding here. Is this idea landing? So, yeah, Tara, question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're going to get into this or not, but how do you present data that isn't perfect to industries that are on the more perfection side, such as like I'm in healthcare right now. So, how do you present that type of data or share that with your stakeholders that are in a perfection driven industry?
Yeah, we'll talk about this a little bit with some of the upcoming techniques. But one of the things to think about is that there's different ranges of uncertainty that your organization already accepts. Right? If you're talking about an executive who's evaluating a merger of hospitals, for instance, right? They're not calculating that down to the penny. They are thinking about order of magnitude. What would be the new revenue that we would gain by absorbing this organization, right? Ballpark, where do we think that there's going to be some operational efficiencies? And so, if we had the ability to make 10% of our staff redundant, right? What would that mean in terms of labor savings? And then they're using those sorts of ballpark estimates in order to figure out, is there a business case for this? Your sales teams, your marketing teams, they are great at playing with these ranges of numbers already. There may be other pockets of the organization that also are working in that space. Part of your goal should be to think about who is already doing that work where it's not quite as precise, but there's still some numerical data that they can suggest around it, and how are they communicating it to the executives? Let's talk about some more specific techniques we can use here. I'm going to introduce 3 of them as we go through to clarify what we're talking about, to use a technique called a Fermi decomposition in order to construct a chain of inferences or to measure the observable consequences. You'll see in the footnote here, Douglas Hubbard, How to Measure Anything. This book is a phenomenal resource in this space, and if you want to dig deeper into any of this stuff, I would strongly recommend checking out what he has done. The operational definition technique, I think, is best illustrated with a story. In my work in talent development, I don't spend a whole ton of time making life and death decisions, and certainly I don't do that in a short notice. But there are professions where that's very much the norm, right? And so when we're thinking about, how on earth could we measure if a newborn infant is healthy? Very high stakes, very complicated. Time is of the essence, right? If we're trying to answer the question, how can we measure the health of the newborn in 2024? Right? The answers that I would expect people to offer will be things like, machine learning or, statistical regression analysis, right? Data mining of, patient records, those sorts of things. In 1952, they did not have any of that, but as Andrea anticipated here, what they had was perhaps even better than that. There was a woman named Dr. Virginia Apgar. And while many of us don't know who she was, the work that she did in creating the Apgar score is incredibly well known, because she took a couple of decades of clinical experience and said, there's some things that I just know from my experience in this profession are warning signs that an infant is not doing well. And there's some things that I typically see when they're going to be able to make it without additional medical intervention. And she wasn't trying to do a statistical analysis here. She wasn't trying to weigh the different factors together. She said it's 5 things: breathing effort, heart rate, muscle tone, reflexes, skin color. Each of them we can score 0, 1, or 2, right? We get a 0 to 10-point scale. And if an infant comes out and at the 1 minute of life mark that they have an Apgar score of 3, something is not good. And I don't know exactly what the cause of it is, but based on our clinical experience, we've identified that there's some specific interventions that we should activate at that point. So we might bring in some heating lamps. We might bring in some additional oxygen. We're probably going to page some additional medical personnel so they can be in the room. And by doing this very straightforward process, which again, was based on just clinical judgment, we've been able to, in the almost 80 years since then, to save tens of thousands of newborn lives every single year. Huge accomplishment from just saying, when we talk about the health of the newborn, let's cue on these 5 characteristics. I don't know if these are the perfect 5. If we were to do a new Apgar score today, I don't know if we've come up with the exact same factors, but this has been good enough to have some pretty significant impacts on newborn mortality. And that's the premise behind our first technique of an operational definition. All we're doing is saying, we've got this abstract concept, in this case, healthy newborn. Let's figure out a procedure for translating into a measurement of some kind. We're going to look at these 5 things. We're going to give them a score of 0, 1, or 2. Right? There's a lot of different ways we could construct an operational definition, but an Apgar score is a great example of how we can do that type of process. I'll give you an example that resonates maybe a little bit more with our experience here, something that we went through at Douglas Dynamics recently. We had a lot of executives a couple of years ago that were saying, as an organization, we've got this cultural value of develop self and others. We really want to be a learning organization and have a learning culture. Cool, right? How would we create a metric around how we're doing there? And we essentially walked through this process of creating an operational definition. We said, first of all, we've got to get on the same page. When we are talking about having a learning culture, what does that mean for us? And we threw out a lot of different ideas. We ended up coming to a rough consensus around a couple of things: that employees are going to be seeking out development on their own. That's going to be an important indicator that we're a learning culture, and that employees are regularly engaging in development experiences. These are by no means the correct answers. There's a lot of other things that we could have chosen here. But we had conversations with our stakeholders where we agreed that for our purposes, these would capture the spirit of what we were paying attention to. And if we saw that these things improved, then we could feel confident that, yeah, we were doing better on having a learning culture. Once we had gotten to that agreement, then we could start looking at how could we use some data in order to reduce our uncertainty around this. What kind of measurements or observations would help us to feel more confident about how these things are trending, right? And we realized that we could look at just some data in our learning management system, right? We can calculate what percentage of our employees have engaged in voluntary learning experiences, right? The voluntary required is a simple metadata code. We know what our employee population is. We know who did training. The percent of employees engaged in multiple learning experiences, also something we could do. We had no idea what the right number for this is, but we said, let's try 3, right? If someone's attended 3 learning experiences over the course of the year, right, that probably indicates that they're interested in their development and engaged in this, right? I don't know if that's the right number, but for us, that's a good rough and ready definition. And then we were able to leverage some data in order to see how we were doing there. And we started tracking, what is our percent of employees that have gone through voluntary training over the course of the year, and what's our percentage of employees that have become our repeat customers, right? Our repeat learners who have done 3 or more of those experiences. And this data did a couple of things for us. Number one, when we went to the executive team in order to present how we were doing on driving a learning culture, because we had had those early conversations, they were on board with this capturing the intent of what we were looking for. Over time, we have evolved this, right? So this year, one of the things that we're thinking about is that a learning culture means that our critical talent is thinking about the next step in their development. And so we're tracking whether our top talent, as identified by our talent assessment and succession planning processes, have development goals that have been established in the system. And we've got a metric around the quality of those things, right? But we didn't have to start there, right? This was good enough for the starting point of that conversation. And now, because we were tracking some metrics, we were able to make some better decisions about what we needed to do in order to support a learning culture. So, manufacturing organization, a lot of frontline employees that do not have ready access to computers. What we quickly realized is that we were not going to be able to hit this metric if we didn't have people who could lead live classes physically on site at different locations. And so this was able to inform decisions about our travel strategy and which locations we needed to hit multiple times, which ones we might be able to capture as part of another visit that was happening for an operational reason. It allows us to figure out, did we have the right content for different audiences? Because we saw there was great uptake from our sourcing department. Our sales and customer support team wasn't as engaged in learning. Cool. We can ask why and figure out what sort of things might be more relevant for them. So that is an example of how we worked through an operational definition in order to give some legs to the idea of learning culture. I'll pause here and see what questions you have. I see that there's a couple that are coming on the chat already. So reviewing development plans to determine the quality of them. This is something that we're working through right now because it's going to be a new metric for us this year. We are looking at 2 different options to do this. Number one is doing some sampling, just to say, if we're looking manually at a subset of these, how well are they doing on some of the characteristics that we expect for good development goals. We are also looking at using some AI tools for this. So having a rubric of what a good development goal should be, and having it give some scores in a couple of areas here. That's things we're still experimenting with. Unique learner is going to be let's put it like this. Repeat learner is going to be a subset of unique learners. So you can't do 3 or more experiences if you haven't done that first one, right? Every repeat learner is going to be a unique learner, but it was telling us 2 different things. It was telling us what's the breadth that we've been able to touch our employee population and how deeply have we been able to affect them. Now, again, this is a conversation that we've been having over years with our executive team. And so when we started out, we wanted to look at both of these because we didn't know what the data was going to show us, but we thought they were good starting points. over time, we have realized that the repeat learner metric is so driven by where our travel strategy is with our shop floor employees that it's not as informative for us as the unique learner metric. And so this next year, we're probably just going to have unique learners in the Met development goal metric. That is operational definitions. Technique 1, the APGAR score. Are we ready for technique 2? All right. From hospitals to pianos. Enrico Fermi was one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. He became the very first person on the planet to know how powerful the explosion was at the Trinity test site. The reason he knew that is because he wasn't waiting for instruments to tell him the blast radius. He held out a piece of paper, watched how far it blew because of the force of the blast, and then back calculated how powerful the explosion must have been at the epicenter, given how far away he was from it. Brilliant guy. He became even more infamous when he started giving these sorts of physics challenges to his college students. And one of the problems that he would pose for them was to get them to think about how much information they already knew about different concepts. And the example is about piano tuners. So rough numbers are fine for this. But off the top of your head, I'd love to hear some guesses in chat. How many piano tuners work in Chicago? This is the moment where people are like, 21, 3, 67, 350, 875, 6, 7. All right, so we've got a fair range here. Anyone feeling particularly confident in their answer? Lots of head shaking. The basic idea of a Fermi decomposition is that we can take a big number or a big concept, a big quantity, and instead of trying to estimate it directly, we can break down the component parts that we might be able to estimate a little bit more effectively. So let's try a couple of pieces here. Right? Instead of thinking about how many piano tuners work in Chicago, how many people live in Chicago? Anyone got a range that they feel relatively competent in for that question? Yeah, I'm going to see if I can pull up some annotation tools here. Go ahead and just pull yourself off of mute. Let's call out some numbers here. How many people do we think live in Chicago? Let's say Chicago proper, the city. All right, so I see a 2.7 million. Let's do just some quick ranges here. Anyway, 750,000. Okay, so we've got below 1 million as the answer there. Anyone think it's below 500,000? No. How about in the high end? So we've got 2.7 million. Anyone think it's above 5 million?
No.
No. So we've got 0.5 million to 5 million as our potential range there. All right. Next question. How many people are in an average household? Again, ranges are fine. Go ahead and take yourself off mute. Someone call out what you think this might be.
3 to 4.
3 to 4. I'm kind of comfortable with that. All right. See no disagreement among the group. What portion of households have pianos? Not keyboards, but like actual pianos that could potentially require tuning. Anyone think it's over 25% of households?
I think it's about 5%.
5. All right. If we work down from 25, 10%, does that still feel too high, or does that feel plausible to anyone?
Too high.
Still too high. All right. So we're gonna say it's probably not 0, but that 5 to 10% range, is that kind of feeling plausible to folks? Not asking you to bet your salary on this, but like we'd be surprised if it was outside of that. I'm gonna put the 10% there just to keep us honest with ourselves. How many tunings does a piano receive a year? Anyone think there might be some pianos out there in grandma's home that get 0 tunings a year? All right. Are we pretty comfortable that the average is not going to be greater than 1?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we get 0 to 1 there. And maybe one more question here. Cost of the average piano tuning. Again, ballpark here. Do we think this is going to be like the $100 range, the 500, the 1,000? I'm seeing some numbers in chat here, 150, 250, somewhere there. And anyone think it's going to be above 500? No. So we're going to say like 100 to 500 here. Okay. And now this is the fun part of the session where I get to try to do some mental math here. On the high end, if we're trying to figure out how much money is available for piano tunings to support the professional piano tuner population in Chicago, all right, we've got on the top end 5 million people across 3 people per household takes us down to, what is that, 1.5 million households, of which 10% have pianos. And so we've got on the high end 150,000 households here. Maybe they need a single tuning a year, so we're talking like 700 or 75,000 to 150,000 potential tunings at 100 to 150 a piece, right? On the high end, we've got a handful of $1 million available for a piano tuning. Again, I'm freestyling the math here, work with me. But I'm willing to bet that piano tuners aren't paid like software engineers, right? They're probably not making the 6 figures. So if I'm trying to ballpark this out, at the high end, we've got hundreds of piano tuners, but not thousands, right? And if we did the same thing thinking on the low end, again, that's a lot of money to share among 10 piano tuners, right? But I could imagine having 100, right? So, I mean, again, depends on what decision we need to make. But if I'm trying to decide what hotel to book for the annual Chicago Piano Tuners Convention, right? I don't need to reserve, the stadium for any of like the professional sports leagues, right? This is going to be in your Holiday Inn Express type conference center, right? And so this technique, what we've just walked through, is an example of a Fermi decomposition. If I needed to refine my estimate even further, say there's still too much uncertainty here, right? I can pick any of these elements and narrow down the range there a lot more effectively, right? So how many people live in Chicago? I am willing to bet there's some census data that might help me on that one, and how many people per household, right? Cost of the average piano tuning, hello Google, right? You can probably give me some ideas there. And so I've got some ways to be able to improve my estimates here pretty easily, right? The basic idea of a Fermi decomposition, and again, this is getting to the conversation that we were having earlier about, what if you're in a field like healthcare where there's very, precise numbers happening on the operational side? Well, the answer is that there might be some precise numbers operationally, but I guarantee your sales and marketing teams, when they're trying to figure out, what would be the value of outreach to this particular community, they're going through a very similar process of trying to figure out, well, how many people live in that area? What portion of the patients might we be able to capture? What kinds of visits do we expect that they would have? And how much would we be able to bill for those? What would be the cost of providing those services? And they can figure out, is that something that's likely to give us a positive return on investment? Does it make sense for us to consider that even further? Let me pause here. What questions or comments about this technique are running through your head? In just a second, we'll take a look at how this applies in our context, which is leadership development. We're good? Keep going? All right, let's talk leaders. You've got an executive who's saying, hey, we've got a problem with the development of our leaders. And you say, I would love to help you figure that out. What's the cost to the organization of not having effective leaders? And you start doing that discovery conversation with the executive, may bring in some other partners here, and you start to draw, there's a couple of things that you might look at in order to, AI estimates, 225 piano tuners in Chicago. We're in the ballpark by just freestyling this. That's pretty cool. We know that good leaders get more out of their team members, right? They encourage them to accomplish more. They are able to set stretch goals. They're able to kind of keep the team motivated and engaged, right? So there's potential loss if we got bad leaders, right? We might be leaving something on the table from disengagement. And then we also suspect that people tend to leave their managers rather than organizations. There's a turnover cost here, right? We could potentially generate more ideas here, but we can use this as a starting point for breaking down the potential that we have if we can improve our leadership development. And we can break down some of these things even further, right? How could we quantify what we're leaving on the table from disengagement? Well, we can do some estimates of how much more productivity our best leaders get out of their teams compared to the leaders that are, having really disengaged teams. And if I don't know that number, Gallup's probably got something I can use as a benchmark. Our current productivity rate, I guarantee your finance folks know that. That's the total value of goods sold and the labor expenses for the year. They keep very good track of both of those things, or they are not good at their jobs. And then what percentage of our employees are disengaged? If I've got a pulse survey that I'm deploying, I can look at some of that data. Or maybe I just talk with some leaders and kind of get their temperature check. Even if I end up with a really large range here, it's somewhere between 25 and 75% of our workforce, it still might be enough to get us some good ballpark estimates here. Someone in the chat just asked about productivity. Productivity is just outputs divided by inputs. So when we're thinking about labor productivity, it's what's the value of stuff the organization churned out. So the value, total sales essentially. And then the input metric there is cost of labor. Divide A by B, you have your labor productivity rate. Cost of turnover, again, we can benchmark this relatively easily. Our current turnover rate is something your HR team should be able to tell you. The cost to replace employees as a percentage of salary, they might have some estimates of that, or SHRM would have something that you could use. And then hopefully you're able to figure out what the average salary is in your organization. If not, there might be some additional things we need to look into, right? But we can quickly get a sense of when we talk about leadership development, is this a $10 million a year opportunity for us as an organization? Is this a $200,000 opportunity? Is it somewhere in between? And depending on where I end up on those scales, right, it becomes either really easy to ask for budget for a leadership development program, or maybe I even need to, hire someone to do that, right? Or to say, that might not be the critical lever for us to pull as an organization. Let's look somewhere else, right? Or you might realize it's a $2 million a year problem, but we know we're not going to solve each of these things 100%. And so now we've got to start making some estimates of how effective do we think this program would be? Can we get a little bit more detail? Maybe there's a more targeted population that we should be focusing on. And so it's not just going to be leaders across the board. Maybe there's a particular department or two that we think we could really change the engagement level of those teams with some targeted interventions. Right? That's the way that we could apply a Fermi decomposition in order to get some ballpark estimates so that we can make better decisions as an organization about where to allocate our resources. Again, let me pause here. How are we feeling about this idea?
Good.
Awesome. We are nearly at the hour mark. We've got one more of these techniques to define metrics before I'd like to go for a break. Are we good for continuing to push forward? All right. Let's rev up the speed a little bit. Every year, 20 of the world's best drivers take to the streets of Monaco. The Monaco Grand Prix is arguably the pinnacle of motorsport. And one of the things that's unique about the Monaco circuit is that the winding, narrow streets make it incredibly difficult to pass on track, which means that qualifying becomes incredibly important. And being able to shave even a 1/10 of a second off of your lap time can mean the difference between starting on pole position and having a great Sunday race, or being stuck in the middle of the pack and having to hope that there's a safety car so that you can gain some positions during the race. Right? That is a really challenging environment in order to figure out how to improve that lap time. Now, modern Formula One cars are equipped with a truly ridiculous amount of telemetry. And so you get data traces about the speed that you were at every point in the track and what your brake pressure was, what the steering inputs were, what the downforce is on each axle. Like, there's a ton of sensors on these cars. Unfortunately, they do not give you the Mario Kart version of here's the perfect line to take through this corner, right? There's just no metric for that. But we can ask, well, what would we expect to see if a driver improved their line through the corner? And what we might see, for instance, is that one driver is hitting the brakes a little bit sooner than their partner. And as a result, they're spending longer slowing down, which means that they're covering less distance. And so if you brake too early, right, you're leaving something on the table, right? Conversely, if you're locking up your steering, you probably braked a little bit too late or you didn't use appropriate braking technique. And so drivers can look at these telemetry feeds, talk with their race engineers, and figure out here's a better way for me to attack this corner. I should be braking a little bit later, or here I had some wheel spin coming out, and so I tried to get the power down too soon. Here's a place where I was seeing the wheels slip, and so I was over the edge of the grip at the track at that point. And so they can start to work backwards in order to figure out what do I need to do in order to drive a better line through that corner. This is the concept of an observable consequence. The human performance technology movement did a great job in the 20th century of introducing the idea that what matters is not necessarily behaviors, but accomplishments. And when we think about jobs, there's a lot of jobs that people say we can't measure because they don't know how to measure behaviors, but we can give metrics to the accomplishments. How skilled is a project communicator? That's a very good question. I don't know how to measure the behavior of communication very effectively, but I can tell that some project managers do a better job of working change orders through their projects faster, and others tend to get derailed at the slightest sign of disagreement on their team. So cycle time and efficiency at being able to work through change orders is one of the things I would expect to see from someone who is a better project manager and a better communicator. How exactly did they do that? I might be a black box, just like the black box of what's the perfect line through Monaco is hard to see directly. But I can look at some of the indicators to figure out, are you on the right track here, or is this an area where you can improve? A lot of the work that we do in talent development is going to be this kind of black box, but we can think about what are the observable consequences we would expect to see in order to figure out if things are working the way they should, or if there's areas where we might need to investigate further. Okay? So take the example of an onboarding program. What would we expect to see if we improved the onboarding experience of our new employees? Again, this is an exercise we went through at Douglas Dynamics relatively recently. We came up with some things that, we would expect that number one, we would see a decrease in the rate of our new hire churn, right? Longer term, we would expect to see that new employee performance was in line with existing employees, right? If they're doing a better job of onboarding these folks and getting them productive and setting expectations, then we shouldn't see a gap between how existing employees are performing and how new employees are performing. And so having done that black box thinking of what would we expect to see if our onboarding was effective, we can then start asking questions about what data can reduce our uncertainty here. And we can look at our 90-day retention rate, right? And without putting any specific numbers on the board, you can clearly see that we've done a better job of reducing some of that new hire churn. And we can point to specific moments where there were big drop-offs, right? That 10 to 20-day period was a rough time for a lot of new employees. And so we did some very specific things, knowing that we needed to make an impression on them in those first, couple of weeks in order to have a good chance of retaining them. We are now seeing evidence that those tweaks worked. Right. Ask me in a couple of months and we'll be able to talk about how we've been doing on performance because we've got our annual review cycle coming up. But we certainly knew going into this that there was a pretty big gap in how employees were assessed compared to whether they'd been on the job for 6 months or less compared to folks who had been there for more than 6 months. What we are hoping to see is that this gap has likewise closed up. And if it hasn't, that's going to be really important data for us to figure out what do we need to do differently that this current experience hasn't corrected for. These black boxes are sometimes scary to think about because we don't exactly know what are the controllable input metrics here. We don't know here's what we need to do on day 11 to make sure that an employee is engaged, right? But we can set up a system that allows us to figure out if we're accomplishing what we need to or if there are breakdowns and to identify where those breakdowns are. And again, the purpose of measurement is to reduce our uncertainty. The reason we're trying to reduce our uncertainty is so we can make better decisions. Right? If we see that actually there isn't much of a gap between the employee's performance, then we don't need to spend a bunch of time changing the way our onboarding program does goal setting. Conversely, if we find that that is a consistent challenge and our current interventions haven't worked, we might need to have some conversations with managers about what are you not seeing from your new employees that you expect? And we might realize that we need more job training or that they're spending so much time learning the culture stuff up front that they're not having a chance to actually achieve some of their productivity goals. That might be interesting. Is that a problem of our onboarding program or is that a problem of our manager expectations? That could be interesting to think about what's the right way to solve that. These types of conversations are possible when we start looking at the observable consequences of the different initiatives that we have. That was a lot of me talking. There was a lot to process there. Let me pause and see what questions you have before we have a chance to try to do this with some of our own metrics.
No, this isn't a question, Colin, just an observation. One thing that I think is great with a lot of these examples that you're showing today is that it's all data that your organization is already collecting versus going out to an employee or a manager with a questionnaire and interview. It's just things that you're able to pull out of existing data.
Yeah. One of the great things about realizing that the purpose of data is to reduce uncertainty is realizing that there's a lot of different ways we can reduce that uncertainty. And sometimes there's easier metrics available for us that are going to be good enough for the decision make we need, or maybe at least good enough for a first pass so that we don't have to wait to launch a new survey and then gather baseline data and then see how things are changing. We can sometimes take advantage of some of the data points that we already have, and maybe we add in a little bit of color to that. One of the things that you don't see here is that we did want to get a little bit more insight into what was going on to that new employee experience. And so we did launch a new employee experience survey alongside of this so that we got a couple of data points at that 14 and 90-day mark to figure out if we were missing the boat on some key areas. At this point, that's been helpful for us to think about what we might iterate in the next version of the program, but we didn't need to have it in order to be able to say, is this program moving the needle for us? All right. Well, I want to give you a chance to play with this. And so I'm going to, or I guess we're going to be jumping into some breakouts in just a second here. Each group is going to have probably about 7-8 minutes to work together. And you get to choose. Your group can either pick one of the items that you talked about earlier on in the chat as something that you want to measure, and you can do some brainstorming about what that might look like. Any of these techniques are fair game. You can use the operational definition APGAR scores. You can use the Fermi decompositions, the piano tuners. You can use the observable consequences, right? F1 racing in Monaco. If you don't want to do any of those, or if you're just kind of drawing a blank on some of that, I've queued up an example here that your group can use. So imagine that you've got an executive team that wants to build AI skills because they want to develop customer support chatbots. Right? And your options are to either think about what's the business case for whatever your problem is. If you're doing the AI chat bots, right? How would you potentially use a Fermi decomposition to estimate the value of this initiative? Or, right, you can think about how you might measure it. What observable consequences or operational definitions could you use to reduce uncertainty around it? Again, I'm going to let the groups kind of figure out where they want to play here. If you want to use the AI chatbot example, have fun. If you have something as a group that you want to tackle from your real world scenarios, that is totally okay as well. I don't want you to feel pressure if you're like, this is too much too soon. I can't quite figure out how to apply it in my own situation. So this is low stakes. But what we'll do is take about 8 minutes in the breakout groups, and then we'll come back and I'll just have the groups present out on what they pick to do. Please don't try to do it all at once. 8 minutes is not a whole ton of time. If you pick one example and you do either the business case or how would you measure it, that's going to be great fodder for our conversation. Right? Any questions before we head off to breakouts? Okay. You have 8 minutes. Kate,
Alright.
can you open up the breakouts for us?
Yes. Here we go. You should have an invitation on your screen to join a breakout room.
And I'm going to pause the recording for a moment. See you in a few minutes. All right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to remind myself to resume. Oh, looks like the recording is going. So excellent. Welcome back. It is great to see everyone again. And I'd love to hear just some thoughts from the groups about how you explored this. I'm not expecting you to have gotten to a number. If you did, that's amazing. Congratulations. But I'd like to hear a little bit of the thought process that you went through as a group. The first group was Andrea, Andrew, Heidi, and Victoria. Can I have a volunteer from that group to just tell us a little bit about your conversation?
We'll go ahead and speak. So we started by talking about what do we measure, but this was more on the decomposition, like what do we measure to build out the business case?
Mhm.
So we're trying to determine, do we want to invest in training for an internal chatbot? Do we want to get an external chatbot? But before we can even decide that, we need to figure out, is there a cost benefit to us to have a chatbot? So we were looking at it as the chatbot, the benefit would be to create level 1 requests, which would free up our call center employees to be able to address the more serious issues. So some of the things that we were talking about for terms of measurement would be length of call, but that's not necessarily something that we want to reduce. Length of call currently could be being measured because the idea is to get people off the phone really quickly, but does that then get escalated to become a bigger issue? So by length of call, we would be looking at that as a measurement and actually possibly being lengthened, because we'd be looking again at efficiency. How many requests are resolved on the first call? So that would be one of the things we've been taking a look at now. Are our calls being measured? If there are calls longer, but are they more efficient? How long are people on hold for? So those would be some of the things we're looking at, and then customer satisfaction scores. So by reviewing that, if we're finding that we do have low customer satisfaction scores and we do have customers on hold for a long time and calls are short, but calls are not resolved on the first attempt, then that would be a good business case for us to invest in a chatbot. And then we'd have to determine if there is a benefit for us to build our own internally, in which we would benefit from creating the training, or to invest in an outside pre-built chatbot.
Yeah, Love it. Right. And what I'm hearing there is a combination of all of these techniques, right? So some really clear, like kind of black box things. I don't know exactly what a good call looks like, but it certainly should have that there's a first call resolution. It should have a positive customer satisfaction score. And then we're thinking about, okay, so what's the labor cost of handling these calls? Maybe there's a thing of like, what portion of these do we think would be solved with an AI bot, level 1 versus what would be to escalate, and what would be the cost of dealing with those escalations, right? So really great thinking there. Awesome work. Second group, Anik, Eric, Gretchen, Valentina. Tell us a little bit about your conversation.
So we talk a lot of mostly about how would you measure a given um, uh, thing. However, we went completely off script and didn't talk about AI skills or any of that stuff at all. So we were talking about mentoring programs, something that we're all very familiar with, and how do you measure the effectiveness of that? That is coming from a personal experience of mine and a personal need is drawing up the measurement or the metrics for something like that. And so we talked about different ways of trying to figure out uh, what the baseline was, and then how do you measure it from there, but also who the audience is, what problem you're trying to solve, and then the kind of the same basic topics that we were presented prior to that breakout session is how do you kind of tackle that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, we basically what I did, and it wasn't intentional. It was just kind of express a situation that I'm currently facing and how to, and it became a very good way to crowdsource ideas. And so the team was very supportive of those and gave a ton of input.
Yeah. And I think that statement that you just had about really trying to figure out what's the problem that we're trying to solve here, that's such a critical piece of this. If I'm designing a mentoring program because I'm worried about employees not feeling like they've got opportunities for career development in the organization, and so they're going to be leaving for like future career opportunities, right? A turnover retention type problem. I'm going to have a very different set of metrics compared to if the problem is I've got key successors that aren't going to be ready for this job, and I might have some retirements in the next couple of years. And so, by the way, if I don't have a director or VP of manufacturing or engineering or global sourcing and supply that's ready to step up, right, these types of business strategies are at risk, and there's an execution cost there of like we might fall behind on new product development by X number of months because we don't have someone who can shepherd that portfolio through and be able to manage disruptions appropriately. Right. Nothing wrong with either of those metrics, but there's a ton of value in clarifying which problem we're trying to solve here. Excellent. Andrew, Nicole, Sarah, Thea, what did you discuss? Share a little bit about your insights.
Do you all want me to go since I've got the notes in front of me? Honestly, and you all jump in if I miss anything, but I think our discussion sounded very similar to group one. We were discussing, okay, we did go with the AI skills scenario provided. We talked about whether or not we want to kind of tackle it by what's the business case versus what would you measure. And I think ultimately we kind of just started brainstorming what sorts of things might we measure. And like I said, we came up with very similar items as group one. We talked about number of calls per day. We discussed that those calls are, going to be different types of calls, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and that an AI chatbot is likely going to be most helpful with tier 1 calls. And so what can we do there to look into, how much time that frees up for our customer support team so that they can tackle tier 2 and tier 3 calls. We discussed customer satisfaction score as a potential metric, labor costs, and then as labor/salary metrics for these services. Anything else that I missed, Thea or Sarah or Andrew?
No, looks good.
Awesome. How about Cassie, Melinda, Sarah, Tara? What'd you come up with in group 4? Give us a little preview in that discussion. Or post view, I guess.
I don't, we didn't, I don't know, we forgot to elect a spokesperson, so, I would say that what, we probably had the biggest challenge getting started. And that was something that it kind of took us a minute to get back into the exercise. I think one of the things that we talked about in terms of kind of defining a question, we talked about defining that question as what's the potential impact to customer service levels, as that kind of the initial what question. I think one of the conversations that we had was how operational this process is. And if it's kind of like plug and play with the questions every time, like we were using your question example, was something that we had talked about. And so I think that we were kind of a little light in resources to be able to effectively complete the exercise.
Yeah. Which is totally fair, right? I'm just throwing you into the deep end here and kind of seeing what you can come up with. One of the things that's really interesting is when I run this exercise, almost all of the times groups will focus on some of the operational metrics here, and they'll be thinking about like cost reduction and where are the places where we might incur additional costs and things like that. One of the opportunities is to think about, are there places where there might be situations where we could grow the top line, right? So if we had AI skills in order to develop these chatbots and we were able to establish a strategic market position in terms of our support guarantees, right? Does that open up potential new customers or potential new business for us? This one, maybe there's not a whole ton of opportunity there, or maybe we don't have a ton of visibility into that. But a lot of work that we do in talent development, when we talk about trying to be an employer of choice, right? There's real focus on, trying to grow the pie there and, getting some of the, critical skills that we're able to take on new initiatives, or we've got the capacity in order to drive new things through. And so that might be interesting to explore just in your own thinking, that if you're looking at these value propositions and thinking about it always in terms of just the cost savings potential, are there other dimensions that you should be thinking about as well? And again, that may not apply to all of them, but it's worth asking that question. Okay. Bottom line, there's a lot of stuff that's going on here. Our core question, whenever we're constructing a measurement, is this going to reduce uncertainty enough to improve our decisions? And again, if we can't tie it back to what decision would this be affecting, then it's probably not the right data point for us to be focusing on. It's probably not the right graph for us to be staring at. Now, there is a discovery process here, and as we'll talk about in the analyze section, sometimes you won't know what the critical lever is, and so you start measuring some things and testing in order to try to find it out. But if you're spending a lot of time looking at metrics that you're not going to be making decisions or allocating resources or choosing changes because of what those metrics tell you, that might be an indication that you're not really using data strategically. And so just keep that in mind as you're moving further down this path. Okay. How are we doing? Is this a good time for a stretch break? Awesome. I have that it is almost half past the hour. Let's come back in 10 minutes. Having said that, this is also the place where I do a little bit of soapboxing. There are ways to work with very dangerous substances in a very safe environment. People data needs to be thought about in a similar way. We are accessing some of the organization's most sensitive pieces of data, and we need to treat that with the diligence and care that comes with that. Just like you wouldn't try to, operate, on nuclear waste haphazardly and just hope that at some point it'll be figured out safely, right? There takes some precautions in order to have a safe working environment around this stuff. In the same way, safety should be designed into the work that we do with our people data. We don't want to be making decisions about what data sources we look at or who we share it with or under what conditions when someone is trying to push the issue. We want to have thought about that beforehand. And so it's really important to be proactive in this space, especially as you hear about horror stories of like surveillance capitalism and companies that are monitoring their employees' keystrokes or using their cameras in order to figure out if they're working from home or what 20 years ago, fair enough if you didn't think about that stuff, right? Today, we know that those are types of things that someone is going to ask, well, am I able to track what my workers are doing? Am I able to figure out if they've been looking at LinkedIn job postings while they're on their lunch hour, right? I want to have made decisions about whether we look at that stuff and how we handle that well before we're at the breaking point. And so here's my 5 principles for the ethical use of people data. The first is to be transparent about data use and intent. There's a legitimate case to be made that companies should be monitoring the keystrokes that people are putting into their computers. I may not agree with that case, but I can see there is a case there. If I'm not comfortable telling that to my employees in advance and letting them know what that expectation is and sharing with them why we think that creates a better work environment, or I can't give a good answer to that question, that should be a red flag that we are not comfortable with this culturally and we need to do some rethinking. And so transparency is going to be a critical part of this. Our employee engagement data is something that we take very seriously. And so we will take a look if there's some managers that have patterns of employees being, scoring their teams lower on some of these things, but we are not going to share that with managers directly. And we had a conversation very early on about who gets to see that data and what they need to do in order to make sure that they're using it appropriately. Whenever possible, we want to be preserving people's anonymity. If I am a manager and I'm seeing how my team is feeling about engagement, right? We may decide that we're going to hide some of that data under specific circumstances. For instance, if you only have 2 direct reports, right, maybe you don't get to see the breakout of that stuff, right? If you have fewer than 5 people on your team that responded to their engagement data, then we need to think about, do we have to hide some of that in order to avoid them figuring out, well, only 2 people responded to this. I know that Joe's got it in for me, and so I bet that that data point is from this person. We have these sorts of conversations when we think about 360s. Oftentimes we need to think about this really in almost any aspect where we're going to be having talent data. Along with that, we want to be limiting the visibility of this data to those with a reason to know. What our senior HR leaders see in terms of talent assessments is going to be very different than what our HR generalists see. There's a good reason for that. We want to be thinking about what sort of stuff we share with different audiences and how we make sure that those decisions are going to be things that we feel comfortable with organizationally. We know at this point that there's a lot of ways that past data can encode bias and inequity. And so it's too late if we're having that conversation after we've created a data point. We need to be proactively thinking about, is there a way that this metric is going to have a disparate impact on different populations of our employees? If so, what do we want to do in order to try to minimize that risk? In a manufacturing environment, there's not a whole ton of women on our shop floor. We need to be thinking about how the expectations we have for what a good leader looks like may encode expectations about how men lead. And is that, in fact, the right way to define what leadership looks like for us going forward? If we're not having those sorts of conversations, we're setting us up for a bad situation. And then finally, whenever possible, we want to be keeping the human in the loop. There are environments, right? I think about self-driving cars where humans might not be able to react to a situation fast enough in order to be able to make the appropriate decision. I've heard about scenarios with, artificial intelligence in military contexts where putting a human in the loop could literally lead to losing the war because you're making decisions at such a slower pace compared to your opponent. Hopefully, we are not there yet, but that future is coming. I don't see a world where we need that pace of engagement in human resources. We are operating at people scales, which means that we can make people time decisions. There's nothing wrong with having an algorithm that helps to maybe sort candidates from an applicant tracking system or to give some feedback on what seems to be some of the strengths and weaknesses of different candidate profiles. But I don't want to outsource the thinking about who we invite to an interview to a computer. I want to make sure that there's a human who's involved in that decision at some point, and ultimately they're the ones that are accountable for making the right decision with potentially input from the algorithms. Keep the human in the loop. The work that we do is too important to be slack around this. End of soapbox. Once we've realized that data is all around us, then we've got a lot of options for how we think about being able to reduce our uncertainty around these different metrics. And we already started this conversation. One of the things that's really interesting about the world we live in today is that almost every system that we interact with is generating data automatically. And people will refer to this as ambient data. If I want to know how a project is going, right, there's probably recordings of all of those project team meetings. And I can look at that and analyze who's talking in those meetings. Are we hearing all of the different voices? Are there specific people that are dominating the conversation? Does the decision always end after a specific person has spoken? That stuff is available to us. We can use this data, again, if we've thought about some of these, ethical issues and made sure that it made sense in the context of our organization, right? That can be really helpful for figuring out if we've got folks who are inclusive leaders or folks who are, blowhards that are just driving their opinion through the conversation. There's a lot of different resources that we can use in order to reduce our uncertainty around these different people and talent metrics. So we've already talked about a number of the systems that we have access to, that the HRIS, our learning management system, our CRMs are going to have all kinds of data that we can look at that might be able to help us figure out who's really effective at addressing different customer issues, who's an employee that is engaged in developing their skills, who's an employee that we're at risk of losing because they've been stuck in a particular role for a while their peers have been promoted past them, right? Those are all things that we can look at relatively easily using the data that's already accessible to us. Our business operations are going to generate a ton of paperwork that we can use to reduce our uncertainty about different metrics, right? Again, I work in manufacturing environment. There's a ridiculous amount of computer data around customer orders and the change orders that have gone into those things. And so I can very easily go in and get some good information about what types of work end up resulting in lots of change orders, or if there's specific branch managers that are good at identifying problems before they hit the shop floor. And this all becomes really interesting fodder for us as we think about how we improve the skills of our organization. Project documentation, digital paper trails, all of these things are potentially accessible to us. And some of this stuff might not exist in a electronic form right now, right? You've got paper checklists and safety observation forms, but increasingly there is a push to either digitize these things or to potentially selectively sample them in order to get a sense of what's going on in some of these areas. And then finally, we may end up in a situation where we don't have a great metric for something, but there's a decent proxy that we can look into instead, right? So I may not know directly what someone's skill level is at continuous improvement, but I can look if they've accessed some of the continuous improvement resources in our learning management system, if they've pulled out some of the templates that are on our intranet, if they have been involved in different Kaizen events on the shop floor, if their performance reviews include feedback on their involvement in improvement efforts, what their score is on our Get Better Every Day winning behavior. There's a lot of things that I could look at in order to get a sense of whether this is someone who's demonstrating that CI skill set. And if I don't have a perfect like skill matrix for continuous improvement, I still might be able to figure out this is someone who can help us turn around this area of operations. This is an area where a person might need some additional training in order to be effective with that skill set. The final piece here is that we're not limited to what exists in our organization. There's lots of options that we have in order to supplement our existing data sources. Professional associations will have all kinds of publications around benchmarks and best practices and what others are seeing and what kind of return you might expect on a mentoring program or things like that. Industry or company benchmarks can be useful to fill these things out. Again, earlier we talked about SHRM and their benchmarking data on the cost to replace someone who's left the organization. Great use for us if we're trying to figure out what the cost is of replacing some of these skill sets. There's published research on a number of these things. Sometimes it's from vendors, sometimes it's from third-party sources, but there's all kinds of data that we can pull to, again, which might be good enough for our first pass. And worst case scenario, maybe we do some manual sampling. I was in a production facility in Rhode Island last week, and we didn't have a great sense of what was causing production delays on the shop floor, but I've got the lead in that facility now just doing some daily tracking of what are the situations where he's being pulled in order to resolve an issue. And we're quickly getting some data on, is this most likely because of parts shortages, because of incorrect build instructions, because of labor shortages, bad tools, whatever it is. And that, again, that's been useful for us in figuring out where do we need to concentrate some of our leader development efforts in being able to manage some of this organizational chaos. Questions on gathering data. Again, that was a very breezy tour through that space, but hopefully this is giving you a couple of ideas to think about as you're going back to your daily work.
Hi there. This is Sarah Reynolds. You may have said this. Will we have access to the recording as well as the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's get into the part that I know you've all been waiting for, the math. I kid. We are going to try to show how this can be a lot simpler than maybe you fear it is. Again, I'm working under the assumption that we are not all coming in with degrees in statistics. One of the things that you might hear the profession talk about is different stages of analytics. I prefer to use the language of modes because I don't want to imply that this is a linear progression and you've got to go through all of these in order to get to the end stage here. But you'll oftentimes hear people talk about things like descriptive reporting, right? And this is stuff that I think most of us interact with on a pretty regular basis, where you've got just answering the question of what happened. You've got report aggregations, monitoring metrics, right? How many butts did we have in seats? What was the average net promoter score for this class? How many people completed this safety training? Those sorts of things. How many employees have development plans filled out in our HRIS system? All of that stuff happens at the descriptive level. Data-driven decision-making really starts with this next mode of analysis, which is diagnostic. And the key for diagnostic analysis is that we're trying to answer the question, why did it happen? If you've ever used an Excel pivot table, this is familiar territory for you. You're comparing some of these different categories and slicers and pivots and trying to figure out what's different between some of these different groupings or populations. If you are doing comparisons, right, year over year differences, comparisons between sites, those types of things all fit well into the diagnostic analytics space. And honestly, you can go pretty far just leaning into the diagnostic elements here. Having said that, a lot of people aspire to go further in this process. And so you will also hear people talking about predictive analytics and being able to say, well, what could happen here? At the high level, this can be algorithms and models and linear regressions and machine learning and all of that. It can be a lot simpler as well. And we'll talk about some ways that we can approach this that are maybe a little bit more accessible. And then the final mode of analysis that you will hear people talk about is being able to make prescriptive recommendations. What should happen? So, we see this in consumer technology all the time, that YouTube inevitably knows what video to suggest to me next, except when it goes off and, randomly thinks that suddenly I'm interested in weightlifting competitions. No idea what was behind that part of the algorithm. But the recommendations, the heuristics, in our learning management systems, you might have tools that are recommending, here's the next course or whatever. There's a lot of work that's been done in this space. A lot of the math behind it, I think, has been driven by some incorrect assumptions about what the end goal is, because our model has been consumer organizations. And if you're, a Facebook or a LinkedIn, engagement is your top metric. And so you're trying to get people to do more stuff rather than thinking about what was the effect of it. So some of this is not going to apply to our space very well. But the basic idea of thinking about, if I want to cause this behavior or this output to happen, then we should do this thing. That's something that we can play with. And we'll talk about some examples of what this looks like. Before I get too deep into this, I want to emphasize that this process can feel a little bit frustrating at times, and that is not a sign that you are bad at this. We've got a couple of statisticians and math majors they're mentioning this in the chat. These are not linear problems where you just work through the algorithm and at the end of it you've got an answer. There's going to be some dead ends and some exploration here. And Cole Nussbaum-Knaflic is one of the big names you'll find in the data visualization field. She got famous for some of the work that she did with the people ops team at Google. And one of the things that she talks about is the difference between doing exploratory and explanatory analysis. That when we see people do data storytelling, oftentimes they're explaining, here's what the insight is. And what you see is that very clean PowerPoint deck. What you don't see is all the exploratory work that went into that in order to figure out what's going on here. And as she describes it, there's the process where you're looking at a million different comparisons here. And a lot of those are going to be nothing interesting to see here, move along. It is okay to have that experience. I don't want you to feel frustrated if you're looking at your data and like, there's nothing here that's jumping out at me. You can't engineer an insight, right? You've got to do some of the legwork in order to be able to find, hey, here's something that catches my attention because it doesn't make sense, or it's an outlier, or it's weird in some other way. And so we'll talk through what this can look like, but the basic idea is that there's a process here, and I don't want you to feel overwhelmed if you run into some dead spots early in the process. That's actually part of the work. Are we comfortable with that idea? Yeah. So I'm going to jump back to the idea of a learning culture, and we're going to take a look at how we progressed at Douglas Dynamics against this, goal in 2023. One of the first things we noticed is that towards the end of February, we were taking a look at that unique participants metric, right? What percentage of our employees have engaged in a voluntary learning experience over the course of the year? And what you'll notice is that we were behind pace based on where we were from 2022. And so the descriptive metric is just, we're behind. Right? There's not a whole ton of insight there, but it's a starting point. And so we asked ourselves the question, should we be concerned about this? As soon as we start to answer that question, we need to go into some diagnostic analytics, because I don't know if that number is good, bad, or indifferent unless I dig into it a little bit. And so we had a couple of ways set up in our dashboard in order that we were just kind of keeping an eye on. One of the things that we did is we have a couple of different divisions in our organization. And so we had some essentially slicers or pivot tables that broke down where those numbers were coming from by division. And then we also had an exploration by pay type. Again, manufacturing organization. Our experience of hourly employees is going to be very different than salaried. And so what you'll see here is the way we had laid out the dashboard, this screenshot, is not exactly linear from the slides perspective. But in 2022, you can see that we had those 297 unique learners. And in 2023, at the same point in the year, we only had 254. And you can see some of the differences there. I'm going to give you a second to stare at this and call out if you notice where the unique learners are down.
Is it the salaried?
Yeah, so salaried is definitely one of the big differences here. So in 2022, we had 245 unique learners salaried, only 183 here. There's another place that shows up as well. So in the divisions, where do you see the difference?
Many-
H&D,
Many divisions.
CSI.
Yeah, so our CSI division in 2023 at this point in the year had 139 unique learners. That's down pretty significantly from the 207 that we had in 2022. This is fascinating seeing it with a new set of eyes because yeah, the salary piece totally makes sense, and we'll be explaining in just a second. That's actually not what my eyes fixated on when I was looking at this initially. But what we noticed at the time was that our unique learners were down in CSI. And so now the diagnostic question is, well, why is that? Is there a reason behind this? And we're staring at this, and you won't know this, but we do because this is our organization. Well, we happen to know that CSI actually was rolling out a brand new performance management process in 2022. And so, surprise, surprise, we had employees who wanted to find out more about that process. Now that someone had flagged that, of course, that was a lot of the salaried employees because those are the ones that had access to the virtual learning sessions where that was offered. And so there was an artificial bump in 2022 for that particular division and that population. That's interesting, and now explains a little bit of what's going on with this data. All right, so if the number was artificially high in 2022 and it's a little bit lower now, right? What does that mean in terms of our overall goal progression? Are we worried? And here I'll kind of spoil the punchline for you. You can stare at the charts for a while, or I can tell you that there's a few things that we saw that were bright spots. One of them was that overall the other divisions were up steadily, or relatively steady with their numbers, but most importantly, our total learning had gone up pretty significantly. Again, this is February, and we've got 300 more voluntary learning experiences happening in 2023, even though we didn't have that artificial bump from the performance process stuff in 2022. That's a pretty good sign for us. And so now I'm thinking, yeah, we're still on track to hit this metric. Now I want to know, well, something's going well. Where is that? And again, diagnostic level, I'm trying to slice the data and figure out what comes out for us. And what we noticed is that there was a bright spot with our hourly employees that they had gone from 52 unique learners to 70 at this point in the year. This is an audience that normally is not all that engaged in learning. We hadn't had time to travel to a whole ton of sites, so we weren't bringing them in through that method. They have a little bit more limited access to our learning resources in general because they're not working at a desk all day. This is interesting. What is going on there? So we throw the slicer in, right? This is Power BI. You can click and it'll automatically cross-filter, exact same behavior as Excel. But what we noticed is that our Dejana division, DTE, saw a pretty big increase here. We went from 5, right? A couple of folks had explored the Learning Center up to 15 unique learners. And we went from 41 to 480 or 78 unique learning experiences. Like what's going on here? What's bringing these folks in? There's something that they're doing well. Let's try to figure out what this is. Well, now we're asking a predictive question, right? What is likely to get engagement from this particular audience. And so 15 folks, right? I'm not going to do crazy statistics with this. I'm going to pull up a list. Here's my 15 employees. Here's the number of completions they had year to date. And I ask myself again, what jumps out here? First thing I notice is that we have one employee that apparently our learning management system is better than Netflix. Cool. I'm glad we were able to provide you some free entertainment. And it normally happens in this process. You've got an outlier, and so you go back and see if that changes the conclusions of the data once you account for that one weirdo. In this case, it didn't. But more importantly, what we noticed is that the majority of these employees weren't just doing one learning experience, right? They had seen something and they went back and did something else. This is a predictive metric that hourly Dejana employees who complete at least one learning experience are very likely to complete more than one. Has anyone been overwhelmed by the statistical prowess I have demonstrated thus far? Right? This is predictive analysis, right? We have made a prediction that if we get, it's the Pringles can, right? You can't stop at just one. If we can get you to do your first learning experience, this employee base is going to go for more. And so now we get to ask some questions about, well, where should we start them? What should we do sounds very much like a prescriptive question. And so now we're into this final mode of analysis. Again, we're not looking with giant numbers here, so could I use a clustering algorithm in order to try to figure out what's the most popular? I could. Did I do that on a lunch hour because I was bored? I can neither confirm nor deny, but I don't have to, because I can just pull up a list of courses here, see what they've completed, again, if you're in manufacturing, some of this might make a little bit more sense to you, but the pattern that jumped out to us as we looked at this data is that there was a lot of stuff from our continuous improvement library about using the 5S principles and lean in order to improve kind of your overall workspace. And so this led us to formulate a prescriptive analytic that we should recommend this 5S training to our hourly employees who have not yet completed any learning experiences this year. And all of a sudden, we have now an initiative on our plate to do some marketing to those business unit supervisors and encourage them to talk with their teams about this resource, to share with them how it might help them on the job, to give them time to access the computers. And surprise, surprise, we end up seeing a pretty big increase in our unique learner metric over the course of the year because we had identified that this is a population that seems to benefit from a recommendation for this particular type of learning. I hope that the takeaway from this is that analytics do not have to be scary and complicated. There's very simple stuff that we can do in order to figure out what's likely to happen. What should we be recommending to folks? Right? If I'm taking a look at data about employees' relationships with their managers, and I'm trying to figure out like what keeps people engaged in the organization. And I see that a number of managers have consistent one-on-one conversations on a repeating cadence on their calendar with employees, and those employees tend to stick around more. And the managers who don't have those one-on-ones regularly scheduled on the calendar see a little bit higher turnover. I have a predictive metric that consistent one-on-ones are going to improve employee engagement. And now I can make a prescription that specific managers should be holding one-on-ones more consistently with their employees. Depending on the size of my audience, I might even be able to make some recommendations about what the right cadence of those meetings is. Is it weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? Do we see that there's not as much a retention effect if you're only having those regular meetings on a quarterly basis, right? And I might be able to get this from Outlook calendar data. I might be able to look at when goals have been updated in our HRIS system. I might be able to look at communication chains between managers and their employees. Again, there's a lot of different ways that I can approach this. I might even just do some random sampling that I know that there's a couple of really good managers and ask them, hey, how often are you having one-on-ones with your team members? Just pull up your calendar. Let's take a look at the last couple of weeks. got a couple of managers that I suspect are maybe a little bit less committed to this practice. Hey, let's take a look at your calendar. When's the last time you met with Joe, right? And that might be good enough for the analysis that I need to do. Let me pause here. Questions, comments, fears about the intense mathematical rigor that we have just seen?
I just have a comment that was super helpful. I enjoyed kind of walking through that predictive, prescriptive, and like looking at your data and then kind of building the story around it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's a lot of power in just kind of staring at the data and thinking about what are the right questions to ask here. And I think one of the really powerful things is that when you get good at how we formulate metrics, it becomes a lot easier then to come up with different experiments you can play in order to figure out, like, is this actually a relevant input metric for us? Is this something that's going to be likely to move the needle? Right now, we're doing some experiments around how we drive attendance to our open enrollment classes. And so, we're able to see things like how often did we announce that these classes are happening? How much lead time did we give folks? What was the saturation rate of those classes? And we're starting to figure out that some of those things matter a lot more than others in order to get the attendance in those classes. Again, this is the beginner version of data analytics, but there are some more advanced tools that are available. And so I'll just let you know if you want to explore this with some folks. There's very well-established statistical tests that you can use. It can be helpful if you're moving more towards those predictive or prescriptive analytics. Doing correlation analysis of variance is a technique when you're looking at categorical data, right? So like men and women as opposed to like a 0 to 100 range. Regressions are possible here. There's a whole bunch of stuff. I come out of a manufacturing environment where we've got some Six Sigma black belts, and they use stats that are even above my head. But there's things that are available, and there's people who are really smart at this stuff. Qualitative analysis can also be very useful in a lot of contexts. Data coding, we saw a very simple example of that just a second ago when we looked at the class titles and said, oh, by the way, a lot of these are related to the 5S skill set. But there's more formal ways to do that as well. You can use sentiment analysis. There's contextualization techniques. There's a lot of things that you can do in order to give a little bit more rigor to some of the qualitative side of the spectrum. And then finally, machine learning is a thing. If that's the space that you're playing in, either you're really good at this stuff or you should be paying a data scientist, because it gets kind of crazy pretty quickly. The logic behind it is relatively straightforward, and to be fair, like you could teach yourself Python and just boot up your TensorFlow code, but do you really want to? Maybe you do. Let's take a moment to process this in a group. And what I want you to think about is what sort of analysis you can explore. Again, you can go back to the example you had in your earlier breakout, or if you want to jump over to the AI skills, you can. For this, assume for the moment that the AI skills design team has mapped out critical knowledge and skills. You've developed some resources, and now you're evaluating some work samples from participants that are going through a pilot program. And so you're looking at different stages of this. And I've got a couple of questions here that I'll just pose for you that you can explore. What could you explore if you saw dramatic gaps in work quality on a specific project, right? What may be some of the ways that you could slice that data in order to try to figure out what's going on there? What could you explore if you saw consistent quality differences between groups of participants? Are there some ways that you might want to splice that? Did that maybe inform some recommendations that you make? And then if you saw that there was a time that lag between submissions, and submission A to submission B was pretty consistent. Submission B to submission C was in line with that. But after project C, right, C to D, there's a pretty big lag there, right? What might you explore there? What might be some of the recommendations or some of the diagnostics that you do? Is there any predictions that might come out of that that would be helpful for you in making future decisions here? These are all just ideas to tee up. I'm not expecting specific answers here. I'm more looking for you to have a conversation. But let's take 8 minutes in our breakouts and see what we come up with. Any questions before we send you loose? All right. Good luck. Have fun. All right. Welcome back, everyone. It's great to have you here. And I'd love to hear just some thoughts from the groups. This we can do a little bit more freestyle. So I go for maybe 2 volunteers and just share a little bit about what came out in your group conversations.
I can go. My group, we continued with the AI skills example, and we kind of tackled the first 2 exploratory questions. So for the dramatic gaps and the quality differences, and I think we took a diagnostic analysis approach for both. And so if we look at the first one for the dramatic gaps, some of the things we were considering was, okay, what was the level of training that these groups of participants received? What was their training performance like? Did we have some people who did really well, or maybe there were others that didn't perform as well? And you know, would that have had an impact on it? How long has it been since they were trained? Are they using any other levels of support beyond the training? Are they referring to job aids or that sort of thing? And then even down to who was the facilitator and what was the delivery method of the training?
All great things to dig into. Love it. And the important point here is that at the front end of this, we don't know which of those is going to be the right piece. And it might be a combination. It might not be none of those. We might end up in a situation where we see that there's a difference there, but we don't know if it's significant enough. And so maybe we need to gather some additional data points, or we run a small experiment, or we do some focus groups. There's a lot of things that we can do in order to continue digging in if necessary. Awesome. Anyone else have ideas that came out during your conversation?
I can just say we were very similar in kind of looking at it in 3 ways: as what did the skills that they brought in, how did that differ? How was the training delivered? And then engagement and leadership support. So kind of looking at how to infer from the 2 different participant groups where those differences lie. So very similar to Victoria.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, analysis can get very hairy at times, but there is an easy and accessible version of this. And the key for us is to be willing to do that legwork in order to find out where there's a story, and then have the tools to be able to tell what that story is. And so that transitions us to our final section about how we communicate these insights. Are we ready for the home stretch? All right. If you've zoned out because that was too much numbers for you, this is a great place to reset. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but honestly, as we think about the different skills that are necessary in order to really do this sort of work in the future, everyone's that's involved in projects should have the ability to ask good questions and to understand what decisions are driving this. The ability to formulate metrics might be a little bit more specialized. That might be focused a little bit more on some of the senior leaders or stakeholders. The ability to gather data might be a little bit more folks involved in the operations. The ability to actually crunch the numbers might be focused on a little bit more of a team of analysts. Again, if you're a one-person shop, congratulations, you're doing it all. But there's some abilities to divide out roles. It will be very rare that someone is wearing any of the hats here and they don't need these data communication skills. And so this is a great place to kind of come back and say, all right, here's something that I can leverage regardless of which hat I am going to be carrying. The good news is that the rules for data storytelling are the same things we say in every communication class that we have ever taught to anyone ever. We need to figure out who our audience is, right? Who cares about this? How is that going to influence what what's in it for me is? we need to be able to share some context. What stands out so that we're able to direct their attention appropriately? This becomes even more important if we've been doing the analysis piece. Because if we've dug under 1,000 rocks, we know this thing is weird and it tickles my radar that something is unusual here. The poor executive who is getting this report from you has no idea about that. And so the more that we can share what that context is, so they've got some way to recognize that this data point is interesting, the easier it will be for them to understand our message. The final piece of that is that we need to make sure that message has an impact. What's the meaning here? What's the takeaway? What's the significance? If we go back to our original conversation about using data in order to reduce uncertainty so that we can improve our decisions, right? What should this be affecting about the way I think about this decision? What should this be pushing me to do or to evaluate differently? And so we're going to work through this again with another example. In 2023, our organization realized that we had a lot of shop floor associates who had need for development of hard skills, right? Welding, running a press brake, being able to read blueprints. And I certainly don't have the qualifications to teach that stuff. And so we partnered with a content provider in order to get a library of hard skill training. This first year is a shot in the dark. We talked with some folks and we hope we picked the right titles out of there, but we had no clue what to expect from a usage standpoint. We had no clue what were the pieces that were going to resonate with folks. No clues, maybe a little bit strong, but like we had a lot of unknowns. And so that first year, and even that first quarter, we're trying to figure out what should we be thinking about in order to improve this experience for our employees. And so what you see here is a screenshot from our learning operations dashboard. We had built out a metric to be able to analyze this at a glance in a couple of different ways. And so we had the overall how many courses were started. We had that broken down by the pay type of the employee. We had it broken down by division. And kind of staring at this and trying to figure out what I need to communicate to folks. 3 different stories. I want you to pay attention to how the visualization of that story changes as we adjust the audience, the context, and then the meaning, right? So the first story that I want to tell is for our OD leadership. And the context here is that we didn't know how many starts we were going to have. We bought a certain number of licenses, and there's a particular message I need to communicate to them, which is that early on, we might have under budgeted here. And so before we get to the end of the year, I want you to at least be thinking about the possibility that we might need additional resources. Right? How am I going to communicate that message? Well, one thing I can do is make sure that my chart is providing the appropriate context, right? So here's what our usage is over time. Here's our available total of licenses, right? And it doesn't take a genius to see that we've gone through a lot of that in the first quarter of the year. Now, we might wonder, has it leveled off, right? Is it going to go somewhere between, here and here, right? But there's a large area here that I need to be thinking about. Like we could be above that line. And so it's not a crisis yet. The meaning here is alerting them about a possibility, but that context is helping them understand that we might have, we might need a bigger boat. One of the things that we did in order to communicate that message is that the chart title is making that ask, that decision, a lot clearer. This is not a chart that is titled Thor starts versus available licenses. Because if that was the chart title, then I'm leaving the stakeholder to draw the conclusion there. I don't know what conclusion they're going to draw. Just a simple thing of shifting the title to be in the first quarter, we've already used half of our annual Thor's licenses, does a lot better job of setting the context for that decision and getting them focused on what I want the meaning to be. We're going to change the game a little bit. Let's suppose that the audience here is our divisional leaders. And I want them to be promoting this as a resource to their employees. The context here is going to be then, I want them to be looking across each division in order to see how they stack up. And the meaning there is that there's specific folks that need to up their game. And I want to get some more advocacy from my champions from those folks. Right? The first thing that you'll notice is that for this story, I'm using a different visual. I want to do a comparison. And so that's going to be a bar chart, not a trend line to show where we're going to end up at the end of the year. I'm also going to be creating some context by highlighting our outlier here, the Henderson division. And I have a title which is really emphasizing that they are lagging behind. Right? I've done a couple of subtle things here in order to communicate that message. Right? Even if I had put that, different divisions onto this chart here, it would not have had the same impact as saying, what I really want to do is draw your attention to how different this is, right? And so I've shifted the bar chart. There's one more audience that I want to be thinking about as I'm communicating this message, and that is you all, because I know something that you don't. What I know in this case is that not all divisions are created equal. And so right now you can see that Henderson's lagging behind, but I don't think you understand just how bad it is. Conversely, I know that there's one division here that's crushing it, and you probably don't know that right now. So for you, I'm going to share a slightly different context. The context there is that I want you to be able to see how this stacks up in terms of the division's overall population. And so what I'm going to use there is a variation on a stacked bar chart to show that Henderson is not only falling behind, they are falling behind significantly given their employee population. And that DDX group that over here was second from the bottom, all of a sudden they're the winners in this scenario. They're the bright spot that I want to be finding out. Did we get content that's really aligned to what they do? Do they have leaders that are doing a better job of promoting this? Do they have better technology access that makes it possible for them to, look at these resources when they're on the job? There's something different here, and I want to call that out. Just within our organization, I could show this to any of our divisional leaders, and they would intuitively suspect that DDX is punching above their weight, right? For that audience, with the shared understanding, this chart was good enough. For you all, I want to take it the extra step in order to make that really clear, because I don't know if you'd have the ability to see that without visualizing it in some way. Let me pause here. We just looked through 3 different audiences, each with a slightly different context and a meaning that I wanted to take away there. Any questions about how I approached those visualizations or what I changed between those scenarios? Nothing. We're good. Well, then let's talk a little bit about some choices here and some pieces of advice that I have for you. There are really 4 types of charts that we use for the vast majority of our data communication. When we are in the exploratory analysis, we can use a lot more because we're the only ones that are staring at it. I love a good Mary-Mako chart. I love a Sankey diagram. Those are not things I'm going to be showing to most of my stakeholders because it takes some work to understand what those things are communicating. And when I'm trying to communicate a message, especially to someone who's not as intimately familiar with the data, who may not be as familiar with the business context, and who frankly has a lot of really challenging things on their plate, I want to make this as easy and digestible as possible. And so even if I could show what our talent distribution is by readiness ranking and division to show that one division has way too many folks who are in develop for current role, and there's another division that's got a ton of folks who are ready for the next challenge and we don't have a challenge for them, those are important things to communicate, but I'm not going to use a Mary-Mako chart in order to show that to my stakeholders. What I'm going to do is break that down into 2 separate bar charts and break that message so that it's a little bit more digestible. Here are the 4 charts that you want to use. First is a bar chart, the good old classic bar chart. You can break down different components and compare those to each other. It's very easy to see that whatever I'm looking at here, Division 1 is doing more than Division 2, which is doing more than Division 3. When I look at different item comparisons, I've got a bunch of winning behaviors. It immediately jumps out to you that winning behavior number 2 is scoring the best, right? Bar charts are phenomenal for comparisons between groups. This is where their sweet spot is, and the vast majority of the time when we are comparing items, the first thought should be, what kind of bar chart do I need? Yes, there's layers of complexity here. You might have a stack bar chart versus clustered columns. Each of those is going to be able to give you a comparison that is slightly different. But the basic idea is that if you are comparing things, you should be looking at a bar chart. Column charts are sometimes interchangeable with bar charts. There's a slight difference in how I would encourage you to think about them. In general, column charts work well when there's a natural ordering and you have discrete groups of things. So if I'm looking at performance ratings across our organization, low, medium, high, right, it makes sense that the high rating is on the right end there. If I am looking at a time series, right, so here's the number of defects that we had in Q1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. The columns do a good job of kind of showing what that is. But that last graph is a really interesting one because column charts tempt our eyes to look across. And so we naturally see that there's a trend going up here. We naturally see that there is a hump here. That is true regardless of whether the data is actually ordered or not. So if I had this frequency chart, but I was looking at number or percentage of high performers by department, right? And so finance comes before sales. I might stare at that data and start thinking that there's a trend there, even though the data itself is not intended to show any trend, right? If you can imagine looking at this component chart and just rotating it 90 degrees here, right? There's not a downward trend here because divisions aren't a trend, right? That's not an ordering in the real world sense. It's ordering alphabetically, but that's not a real world like meaningful order. And so one of the mistakes I see people make is that they use column charts when they probably should be using bar charts in order to avoid people making the wrong sort of assumptions, right? Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. There's going to be some exceptions here. There's some places where I will break this rule because, like, if I want to add a target line, it's a lot easier to do that on a column chart than it is on a bar chart, right? Excel just works that way. But most of the time, I want to think column, there should be some natural ordering to these things. Totally okay to do it if the natural ordering is like from most common to least common, right? The old Pareto chart is a great example of a column chart. But if I've got something that doesn't have a natural ordering to it, I want to be at least thinking about whether the column chart is really the right choice. Okay. Line charts are version number 3. Time series is a great one here. You could totally take this, time series by quarters and put into a line chart as well. The rule of thumb here is that the more you're going into small intervals, the more you want to be thinking about a time series. The larger the chunks are, then the more it might make sense to do a column chart. But there's not rules here. If you're doing, something that's a year-over-year comparison and you're looking at 10 years of data, throw it on a line graph. I'm not going to come out and take away your data visualization card. The other place where line charts are great is when you get continuous frequencies. So if I'm looking at, the lifespan is the the wrong way to phrase this here. If I look at what an employee's tenure is with our organization, right, and how long they've been there, right, the number of days before their employment stops, right, totally fine to visualize as a continuous frequency. Here I've got some net promoter scores, and so a 0 to 10 scale. I could do it as a column chart, but there's enough granularity there that makes sense to think of it as a continuous frequency. I can do a line chart there and no one's going to come and arrest me. The final type of chart that we will often use is a scatter chart, which is really useful when we want to show correlations, right? I don't know what I'm graphing here, but there's clearly a downward trend, right? Or when I want to show variation. I've got two different groupings of things, and you can clearly see that the stuff in group 2 is a lot more tightly clustered. Group 1 spread out a lot more. What's the common type of chart that you don't see here?
Pie chart.
Pie charts. I hate pie charts. Hate with a passion. Pie charts are really good in a very specific situation. The place where they are good is when you are comparing a part to a whole, right? So if I want to say that 2/3 of our sales are coming from our top 2 products, pie chart is going to tell that story really well, right? The mistake people make is that they try to use pie charts to compare components, right? And so we might have, if I can find my annotation tools here, where did that just go? Right. So if I've got my pie chart here, and I'm saying, we've got this portion of our employees in Division 1, this portion in Division 2, this portion in Division 3, right? I can tell that these 2 divisions are a lot bigger than Division 3. I might guess that Division 1 is going to be a little bit larger because it was first in the ordering, but knowing that with any level of confidence and being able to compare, well, how much larger is Division 1 compared to Division 2? Not very confident in my ability to do that. It's just not the way that we visually compare. Whereas my bar chart here, very easily see Division 1, yes, that is the biggest one. And in fact, I can even estimate the gap here that this pretty close, right? We've got a pretty consistent change across the divisions. I would really struggle to make that sort of inference from a pie chart. And so pie charts are oftentimes overused. Even if you are comparing a part to a whole, we saw an example of that with looking at the starts per employee, right? So here, I could use a stack bar chart and get that claim across just as well. Okay. Let me pause here. Any questions about the types of charts before we start thinking about different ways to visualize stuff? All right, so final exercise as a group. Let's say that we're presenting the results of our AI, chatbot to our project champions. We've got some concerns coming up that the time savings aren't going to be sufficient in order to achieve the project goals, right? Without knowing anything else about this situation, what type of message are we trying to convey here?
Time savings are not sufficient to achieve the.
Sorry, Andrea, you're a little quiet. Can you say that one more
I
time?
know, I'm thinking out loud, but quietly to myself. I was enjoying the math humor in the chat as well. I think I'm getting a little punch drunk here. I want to say a time series because I'm seeing the word time, but I don't actually think that's the right answer. So I'm now trying to think more about it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'll echo that, right? It's probably not going to be a time series, right? If I was trying to show how much time we save compared to what we need for this project to make sense, right? That's not really a trend line. That's not really a change over time. What type of visual are we thinking about here? Valentina, you said in the chat bar chart. Can you tell us what your thinking is?
Yeah, so then you could put the amount of time savings, like our goal metric, and then show where it actually fell. And so
Yeah.
then you would be able to see like what percentage of towards your goal did you achieve.
Ooh, I like so percentage of goal, right? So that's something where we've got maybe goal actual. We're able to see what the gap
Yeah.
might be. As you say that, right, we've got a part to a whole relationship. I might even accept this as a scenario where we're, here's our actual. The important thing is that this is not goal, right? This is the rest.
Mhm.
Right? Because we want it to sum up to 100%. And so the total here is going to be what our goal is, right? That's the whole chunk here, right? I'm game with any of those as ways to visualize this, right? As we break this down further, right, we could think about additional elements that we are prioritizing, right? And so we might have a column chart that's saying, right, here's where we are spending the most time in this process. Here's where the next chunk of time is, and so on. And so we're able to see, right, hey, if we're going to be able to move the needle and get the appropriate kind of time savings, we probably need to be concentrating on these things as process improvements. And if we can't get those parts better, right, then we're probably not going to be able to get this back on track. Is that basic idea of visualization making sense here? Sarah mentioned line would also be good. I don't know what time you type that. Share a little bit more about what you're thinking here.
Well, I was thinking you could have whatever that goal is, and this might be riffing on that last paragraph there, but you could have the goal is this, whatever it is, like 100% or 50%, and then see where you're falling short of that goal.
Yeah, potentially. What you might be describing there is almost a variation on the Pareto chart, right? So if we said, here's the different components that are contributing to, what the time is going to be. And then we said, so after component one, we've had this much time total. Here's our running time after each of these things. And we've got then here's the target of the total time we have available, right? I can imagine that as a visualization. Yeah. This is a place where there's not necessarily a single right way to do it. There's a lot of variations we can play with, but hopefully the basic idea that, there's going to be ways that we can make this message clearer to folks by choosing the right visuals is going to be the takeaway here. And if you remember nothing else as you are leaving this session, first of all, remember that you had fun, hopefully. But more importantly, remember that choosing the right visuals and making clear what the takeaway of those visuals is as important, if not even more important, than the analysis that you do to get to that point. The right visuals can make or break a communication. And so it's really worth developing that skill here. In the slides, I'm going to have some additional resources here. There are some amazing visualization makeovers that are done with the Storytelling with Data team. So it's a YouTube channel, Storytelling with Data. It's a Colin Netflix company, and she does an amazing job of taking a really ugly visualization or sometimes even just a table of data and then walking through that process of figuring out what's the story here, what's the right way to visualize it, how do I remove some of the clutter so it's really clear and easy to hone in on that story. And so again, you'll see that in the additional references for the slide deck, but it's a skill that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit on. And so I encourage you to really spend some time thinking about how you can improve that aspect of your data literacy, because that's something that you can do even with whatever data you're currently working with. You don't need to do any of the earlier stuff in this workshop in order to get value there. Okay. That was a lot. Your brain is probably melted right now. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'd love to hear if there's questions, comments, anything that I can do for you. I don't consult on this stuff. I work within an organization. I love what I do, and I love just being able to talk about these ideas and share this with folks. And so if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn and keep the conversation going, please do so. I'm not going to be trying to pitch you for services. Now, if you are looking to hire a director of organizational development to head up your people analytics strategy, that could be an interesting conversation. But I'm seriously, I love helping people do great work in this space. And I think there's a lot of stuff that we can do as talent professionals in order to just improve our field and our strategic positioning within organizations. And so anything I can do to help you with that, don't hesitate to reach out. Questions, comments, observations, takeaways. I'd love to hear just what's running through your head at this point.
I have a maybe not a question or comment, but like a request for a brainstorm,
Sure.
perhaps. So one of our departments set a metric for measuring, I think the idea was it would measure like the effectiveness of our learning and development by saying they wanted a 90% attendance rate at all mandatory training, which of course that first of all made me laugh because if it's mandatory, it should be 100%. But anyway, and so then we're reporting all these statistics. And then I'm having to dive into the data to figure out, well, okay, yeah, that was August. Half the firm was on vacation. And, all these sort of telling the stories behind why the numbers are going up and down.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you do when you kind of feel like, well, maybe we're not even measuring the right thing? Like the goal was set and we're reporting on this goal, but it's all about attendance. So how do you kind of get people back to that beginning stage? Like, is it by focusing on that first thing you were saying, like, okay, we've got numbers now, but is it really going to make a difference?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the process. I'd ask, what sort of decisions do we want to be making here, right? If we really believe that driving people to these classes is the right thing, and that's going to be what delivers value for the organization, then this is really great data in order to figure out where we might have gaps in getting this message out to others. Right? As part of our onboarding program, our safety training is very much in this bucket. Like before this onboarding program, we were not great at that. And one of the goals of onboarding was to make sure that we were very consistent in specific employees getting the training that's appropriate to their role at specific points in their employee journey. And so looking and saying, hey, we're really struggling to deliver hot work appropriately, or we don't apparently have the coverage in order to deliver this training in X division consistently. Like that's really valuable decision-making insight, right? On the contrary, right, different case, we have a number of folks who in the organization who have asked for project management training. And there's a business reason for that we need to be getting some new product development, going in a slightly different way, that we need some better management of that. So we've got predictability about, what the costs are going to be for some of these new products. So we're, able to be accurate about whether it's going to be a viable, initiative for the organization, that we're getting stuff off of our plate appropriately, right? Things like that. The success there is not going to be that people have completed the project management training. It's going to be that our cycle time has gone down on projects, or our estimated versus actual on project budgets is going to be closer in line, right? Now, attending project management training might be one of the controllable inputs there, but maybe a better input is going to be how many people are using our project management toolkit, and the class is a way to drive folks to that. And so we could instead make our data point, what percentage of our project managers have accessed our project management resource page within the last 90 days, right? Or maybe now we start thinking about other ambient data sources. What portion of our project team meetings have an agenda in the project team meeting, right? And if we look at the change log of the Excel file that is, tracking all this project stuff, right? How many of those meetings have action items that are coming out to them that have been assigned to specific people, right? Now this starts to get really interesting, right? Or maybe we're looking at, we don't have visibility into all of that, but we know that there's a monthly update where they present the status of projects to the business leadership team. Can we do some sampling there and say, we're going to sit in a couple of those meetings and see what portion of those projects actually are presenting a Gantt chart with their current versus actual status that's accurately identified. And if we find that half the projects don't have one of those, maybe that's the lever that we should be trying to influence.
Okay, thank you. That is very helpful. Kind of, you just said that all so fast off the top of your head, but it all makes sense. Once you start saying it, I get ideas. So thank you.
Yeah. And this is a lot of times, like that example is coming really easily because I've been thinking about this lately. Some of this stuff is hard as we think about how we are going to build the skill sets of continuous improvement in the organization or building, fluency with Microsoft's Power Platform. I don't know if I've got a pat answer around those things yet, but I would go through that same process of thinking about what sort of decisions are we going to be making based on this.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Other questions, comments, scenarios, math jokes?
I hope this isn't too specific, but one thing I ran into in my previous role was we had upskilling programs where the time horizon was pretty long in terms of when you would expect to observe behavior change and kind of like the impact of the training. Yet the training budget was an annual thing. And so have you ever run into that, like where you have to prove the worth of a project when you might not have metrics to prove it yet before your training budget gets slashed?
Yeah. So this is a challenging one. And the way you handle this is going to vary depending on your organization's maturity. There may be a situation where your organization, I don't want to say can't be trusted, but maybe where you want to make sure you've got things to show them in the interim because you're not confident that they're going to, just protect that whole time period. And so early in that process, I would ask, what are some interim metrics that we might expect to see here, right? So example right now, we're developing some of our shop floor leads. Having our leads do specific routines like doing some daily problem solving is, we hope, going to increase throughput at our facilities over time. That may not show an impact right away. And so we identified some interim metrics for that project that we should see that leads are discussing with their supervisors what improvement activities they did more consistently as a result of this. And we've got those check-in conversations as a data point that we can monitor. We've got a couple of other things that we baked in there, but that's one way you can do it, is just break down what would be some of the interim metrics that we would expect to see. If you have an organization that's got a little bit more strategic maturity, you can have a really candid conversation about when do we expect to see a payoff from this. And I can't speak to this from personal experience, but I can speak to it from third hand. Jeff Bezos, former CEO of Amazon, his chief of staff is a gentleman named Colin wrote the book Working Backwards about Amazon's business process. And I had a chance to connect with someone who was later business partner with him as they were rolling out the weekly business review process that Amazon used in order to help sort of manage the business. And Colin and Cedric were co-consultants in developing some of that tooling for other technology companies. And then Cedric's a connection of mine. So that's the story here. As Amazon made the strategic bet about Amazon Prime, they had looked at some projections, and they did not expect to see that was going to pay off for the organization until 2 years down the road. Right. And so they had defined, here's things that we expect to see move, and here's the time frame that we expect to see those needles move. And so they had the maturity as an organization to hold the line on that bet, which at that point was expensive enough that was a bet the company bet. But they knew up front that this ain't going to show anything until year 2 at the earliest. And so we're going to have to be patient and gird it out and make sure that we're doing the right things in order to continue promoting it until then. But until year 2, we're only going to have sign-up numbers. We're not going to know if it's in fact increased our revenue or if it's been operationally profitable yet. That is a level of leadership that a lot of organizations don't have. And if that's the boat you are in, are you hiring?
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here for this conversation. I had a blast. I hope you did as well. Like I said, reach out to me. Like I said, I don't sell this stuff. I do it because I love this community and I'm really excited about where you're going. So don't hesitate to reach out and continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Colin. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Don't forget the feedback survey. Thanks again.